Welcome to the GSMC Financial News Podcast, the show that delves into the ups and downs of the stock market, changes in the economy, and news from the worlds of real estate and technology. From breaking news on the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, or the overseas market, to updates on the bond market, if there's money to be made, we've got you covered.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Financial News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Virginia Lucci, coming at you from bright and sunny Montgomery, Alabama. Today, we'll be covering the word on the street and what we're looking forward to next on Wall Street, how our economic policy is shaping up, and if you stick around for the second half of the podcast, I am bringing you the first annual College Football Extravaganza. We're going to look at the ramifications of canceling the college football season, and following the college football theme, I'm going to give you the top 10 wealthiest college football programs. Before we go any further, I want to give you my usual disclaimer. This show is for entertainment purposes only. I am not providing any legal or financial advice. So don't come at me if something doesn't turn out the way we expect it to. This show is for entertainment purposes only. The economy is changing by the second. As always, if you have any questions, please visit an attorney or financial professional for advice tailored to your needs. So now, let's get to it. The word on the street. The Dow Jones Industrial Average falls 80 points on Thursday, or 0.3% to close at 27,896.72. The S&P 500 dropped 0.2% to 3,373.43. The NASDAQ Composite added 0.3% to end the day at 11,042.50. The S&P 500 failed to break above its all-time high once again, despite stronger than expected unemployment data. And we'll do a little bit more on that soon. Stocks ended a rally that left the S&P 500 within a whisker of its February 19th all-time closing high, while nearly taking back all of the ground lost in late February and March in the pandemic-inspired sell-off that saw a benchmark fall around 34%. There is a slowdown in the number of new current COVID-19 cases in the United States, and optimism over efforts to produce a vaccine have been cited as drivers for recent economic gains. High-frequency economic indicators also suggest the recent loss of momentum in the U.S. recovery was beginning to reverse. Retail sales and consumer sentiment are among the economic numbers set for release on Friday. So getting back to jobless claims. Jobless claims fell below 1 million claims, specifically 963,000 for the first time since the virus began. That's the good news. If you can call 963,000 new unemployment claims good. On the horizon, though, is the expiration of unemployment benefits. Over the past few weeks, we had the expiration of the extra $600 in enhanced unemployment insurance, and it means that a record number of unemployed Americans are at risk. And this has been where the media has had their focus. But it's not just the enhanced benefits that's really on the line here and what's really the most concerning. Millions could run out of jobless benefits altogether by the end of the year if Congress does not pass legislation extending eligibility, according to an analyst from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, CBPP. The CARES Act substantially increased the number of weeks those out of work can collect jobless benefits, from most states offering 26 weeks to all states providing a total of at least 39 weeks. However, that 13-week extension, called Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation, PEUC, and the provision extending 39 weeks of unemployment benefits to gig and contract workers and the self-employed, called Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, PUA, expire at the end of December 2020. States also offer extended benefits separate from what was created under the CARES Act in times of high unemployment. Most states offer 13 weeks of extended benefits, but this varies. Florida, for example, offers 6 weeks of extended benefits according to the CBPP, while others offer as much as 20. Unlike the CARES Act 13 extra week, these do not expire at the end of 2020, so someone without a job could claim these in 2021 if he or she does not use them up this year. That being said, those who did not qualify for ordinary state unemployment benefits also do not qualify for the extended benefits. Depending on when someone began collecting benefits and whether they are collecting PEUC or PUA benefits, by early next year, it's likely that millions of people will have exhausted their benefits before finding work. Economists anticipate unemployment rates will remain high through 2021. That could be devastating for families. Most workers whose jobless benefits run out are likely to be left without any meaningful basic cash income support, the CBPP says. Black, Latino, and immigrant workers who have suffered the largest job losses throughout the coronavirus recession would be hit especially hard, according to the CBPP and the Congressional Budget Office. Workers of color are more likely to be unemployed longer and therefore run out of benefits. Gig workers lose out as well. Some workers, including those laid off in 2019 and at the very beginning of the pandemic, could even exhaust their benefits before the end of this year. The number of people currently claiming extended benefits, which kick in after regular UI benefits and the CARES Act emergency UI are exhausted, is at its highest level so far this recession, according to the Economic Policy Institute, or EPI. That people qualify for extended benefits at all is a sign that policymakers should extend the PEUC even further. Gig workers, the self-employed, and independent contractors do not qualify for extended benefits. Unless Congress acts, those workers would lose all of their unemployment benefits come January. And the rich just keep getting richer. Shares of Tesla jumped 13% on Wednesday after the company announced its 5-for-1 stock split on Tuesday. By Thursday, the automaker's gains continued, with shares rising as much as 4%, bringing the two-day total to 18%. We announced on an earlier podcast that Apple is also set to split. Their shares have climbed 17% since this announcement, one that coincided with a blockbuster earnings report. The stock split doesn't change anything fundamentally about the companies, but a lower price per share could appeal to smaller investors that might want to own Tesla or Apple stock but can't at roughly the $1,600 sticker price on Tesla. Tesla said that the stock split was to make stock ownership more accessible to employees and investors in a press release. At the close of trading on August 28th, Tesla shareholders will receive 4 additional shares for every share they own. The split shares will begin trading at the new price on August 31st, Tesla said. As of Wednesday's close, the split would have shares at roughly $310. Tesla stock has also been on a tear this year, fueled by solid vehicle scales, blockbuster earnings, and potential that it could be included in the S&P 500 index. Tesla is up more than 280% year-to-date. Both stocks are acting like history says they should. Companies that have announced splits during the past 5 years have averaged a 2.3% gain between the announcement and the actual split, with more than 68% outperforming the S&P 500, according to Bespoke Investment Group data. It's a different story after the split. The average stock has fallen 0.3% after the split occurred, with just 29% beating the S&P 500. Over the next year, they've averaged a 9.8% gain, with just 47.8% outperforming the S&P 500. While both Apple and Tesla have seen their stocks rally following their split announcement, history suggests that they may underperform once those splits take effect. And this was according to Bespoke's Paul Hickey in an email. He's not the only one engaging in such crazy talk. BTIG's Julian Emanuel notes that with trading free and fractional share ownerships an option, the dollar price of stocks is really irrelevant. You can purchase fractional shares anywhere you can buy stocks. You can buy it on the apps that we spoke about a few podcasts ago. I know I can buy fractional shares on Robinhood. So splitting a share is not as important as it used to be. In the meantime, Apple will go from the largest to the 16th biggest stock in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, something that could theoretically decrease demand from passive indexers. Apple could succumb to Newton's law of gravity in the weeks ahead. One note of warning, though, I would never bet against Apple. In 2012, it was recommended that investors scale back their Apple holdings. This was after the passing of Steve Jobs. The stock fell 28% that year, but it resumed its climb pretty soon after. So it's probably not unheard of to just kind of sit and wait and see what's going on. So far, they only would have lost 1.8% this week. There's a big difference between right-sizing a position and selling it outright. So since Apple shares were up 1.7% on Thursday, they're still making waves on the street. So let's get into a little bit of Apple's successes and failures this week. First on my list is Fortnite. Apple has kicked out Fortnite from the App Store shortly after the game introduced new payment options. That makes Fortnite, the wildly popular shooter game made by Epic Games, unavailable for download on Apple devices. The game is still available on Google Play, but not for Apple users. Earlier on Thursday, Fortnite announced that it was implementing direct payments for in-game purchases, circumventing Apple's commission for transactions through the App Store. Under Apple's App Store terms, Apple takes a cut as high as 30% from developers for payments occurring through the platform, including paid download and in-app purchases. Epic also filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court in the Northern California on Thursday, accusing Apple of anti-competitive practices with its App Store and asking for injunctive relief to allow fair competition. Fortnite is among the most heavily played games in the world, with an estimated 350 million registered accounts as of this year. According to Super Data Research, Fortnite generated $1.8 billion in revenue in 2019. Epic Games has made no secret of its disapproval of Apple's commission, with CEO Tim Sweeney calling the App Store an absolute monopoly in July. This is more bad news for the teens and tweens out there. Other high-profile developers, such as Netflix, have disputed Apple's platform fees. In 2018, Netflix began directing new members to pay through Netflix's own website rather than through the App Store. Lawmakers also raised the subject at a recent congressional antitrust panel. At the hearing, Apple CEO Tim Cook defended the App Store commissions in part by pointing out that it has never raised their fees. Along with the other tech giants, Apple is undergoing an antitrust investigation focused on whether its terms of use amount to anti-competitive conduct. Apple shares are up 54% year to date. That's a loss for Apple and a loss for Fortnite. In other Apple news, according to Bloomberg, Apple plans to launch an all-in-one subscription bundle on October after months of rumors that the company was working on one. This follows earlier reports, including another from Bloomberg, saying Apple plans to launch an Amazon Prime-like subscription bundle, but the report has many more details to consider than before. Apple plans a Prime-like subscription bundle that has News Plus publishers worried. First, it claims the service is internally called Apple One, putting an end to the joking Apple Prime shorthand many of us have been using. The name seems simple enough, multiple subscriptions in one, so it's called One. However, that internal name may not be the final one the consumers see when the bundles finally launch. The report gives a launch date, October. The article says Apple One will launch alongside Apple's new 2020 lineup of iPhones, which has long been expected to be announced in either September or October. This means more details about the bundle may be announced at the same event that Apple uses to unveil the new iPhones and Apple Watch models. It usually takes place in September, but as we know, COVID-19 has changed everything. Apple One will be part of iOS 14. It is currently not a visible part of the iOS 14 beta, but Apple has held features until launch before, usually those that are related to hardware changes in its iPhone lineup, that are now announced until months after the first iOS beta researchers, users, and developers. So that's going to be interesting. I think it's going to contribute to the appearance of antitrust and monopolies, but could also be pretty convenient, so who knows. So the third thing I want to talk about today is something new that Apple's working on. The company is reportedly working on a virtual fitness classes that would compete against offerings from Nike and Peloton via an app for iPhone, iPad, and Apple TV, according to Bloomberg. Codenamed Seymour, the fitness subscriptions would be available as part of a higher-end bundle with other Apple services. I don't know if this has anything to do with Apple One or will be sold in conjunction with Apple One, but it's just something that's on the radar. Presumably, this would involve guided, live, and on-demand sessions. Apple won't sell you bike, rowing machine, or anything like that, but you don't know. I don't know. So it might be closer to ClassPass with aerobic, yoga, kettlebells, and other classes that have limited equipment requirements. As a result of this, shares of Peloton Interactive Inc. Dropped 40% in pre-market trading on Thursday, putting them on track for a sixth straight loss. At-home fitness is really hot right now. I'm not going to a gym anytime soon, so it's really not surprising that Apple is throwing their hat in the ring. The service makes perfect sense for Apple, as products like the Watch and iPhone are already widely used for fitness, health, and tracking. Stocks like Tesla and Apple are the reason why the economy is in the shape that it is. They're the lifeboat of the sinking ship. But we're seeing a really big separation of income between the ultra-wealthy and those who are getting evicted. And I think we need to really focus on this and make sure that we don't have such an inequality of income. Again, not getting political, but I think it's something to keep our eyes on. I'll say it like that. So with that being said, I am going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, I'm going to take a deep dive into our economic policy. And if you stick around for the second half of the pod, we will have the College Football Extravaganza. Yay! Where we'll go over the top 10 wealthiest college football teams. So stick around and roll tide roll.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Thank you for sticking with us. In our last segment, we talked a little bit about the word on the Wall Street and what that's going to mean for you, but we didn't really talk about why and what's the status of the economy for people on the ground. So I want to take a step back and look at what's happening with our economic policy in Washington, D.C. As you know, Congress passed 4 bipartisan coronavirus relief bills in March and April. That put about $3 trillion into the U.S. economy. But Democrats and many Republicans believed additional stimulus was necessary given the fragile economy. And none of this has gone according to anyone's plans. I know I was anticipating that things would get back to normal probably around May or June. Here we are in the middle of August, and I still don't know what's going on. So I think that the legislators in D.C. have had a similar thought process. So they went back to the drawing board last month, but they were really far apart. Democrats wanted a $3.4 trillion relief bill, and they passed one in May, but it hasn't reached the floor of the Senate yet. Senate Republicans put forward a $1 trillion bill that even some in their own ranks thought was a little puny. But there is a substantial group of Republicans who don't want to give any additional money. A new attempt to restart the economic relief negotiations between the House and Democrats ended just minutes after it began on Wednesday. Also on Wednesday, President Trump declared the whole process over during a news conference. At the same time, he was criticizing Democrats' proposals for funding election preparations and the Postal Service as a part of a broader spending measure. Those were among multiple issues that divided the party just during the 2 weeks. The president further stated, quote, "The bill's not going to happen because they don't even want to talk about it, because we can't give them the kind of ridiculous things that they want to have that have nothing to do with the China virus." And those are his words, not mine. The president's comments came hours after House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin spoke for the first time since the talks fell apart last week. But their conversation did not break the impasse, instead leading to another round of finger-pointing. Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, issued a statement after Pelosi's conversation with Mnuchin, accusing the administration of, quote, refusing to budge. That was followed by a statement from Mnuchin, accusing Pelosi of mischaracterizing their conversation and proclaiming that Democrats, quote, have no interest in negotiation. So nothing's going to get passed if we don't get past this logjam. So at the center of the relief negotiation was an effort to renew key parts of the $2 trillion CARES Act, which Congress passed in March. This is the law that offered the enhanced unemployment benefits to 30 million Americans, extended eviction protections, and included other provisions meant to soften the economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic. The jobless aid and eviction protections expired at the end of July, so there's really nothing that protects people from getting evicted. A couple podcasts ago, I did talk a little bit about what your options are if you are evicted. Again, I'm going to say if you've been evicted, then make sure that you consult an attorney or someone that knows the laws that are local to your area. At Wednesday's news conference, Trump also repeated his claim that deferring the payroll taxes would be a great benefit for Americans and that he would make the cut permanent if reelected. He insisted this would not damage the Social Security system, even though payroll taxes go to pay Medicare and Social Security trust funds. Quote, "We're taking it out of the general fund," he said. I don't know how that's going to work. After he was asked how that would work in light of the ballooning deficit, the president replied that we're going to have tremendous growth, so it didn't matter. The deficit for this fiscal year is expected to breach $3 trillion. And this is according to figures that were released on Wednesday by the Treasury Department. So what that means is that the government will have spent $3 trillion more than it brought in through tax revenue, a dynamic that's going to require us to borrow more money by issuing debt. Again, I want to reiterate that this payroll tax cut isn't necessarily a cut, but it's a payroll tax holiday. And the federal government is still going to want their money after the holiday. I think this could be an absolute disaster. Even though the president has promised that if he were reelected, that he would absolve the tax, there is absolutely no guarantee that this would happen. So, in the event that your payroll taxes are not taken out of your check, put that money into a savings account and earn a little interest from the federal government. Don't rely on that to be a permanent cut. The Senate has been in and out of session this week after Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, delayed a planned August recess in hopes of voting on a coronavirus relief bill. He's not really participating in the negotiations, but that's a different story for a different podcast. There are only a few senators that are left on the Hill, and no negotiations with the Senate, and no votes have actually taken place. The House is out of session right now. The Senate appears likely to recess on Thursday for the remainder of the month for their August week recess. It looks like it's increasingly possible that there will be no new deal on coronavirus legislation until September, when an October 1st government shutdown deadline will force legislative action of some kind. Asked Wednesday if it was possible that there would be no deal until that deadline approached, Pelosi said, "I hope not. No, people will die." And to me, that's absolutely chilling. I think both sides need to really get on this and come to the negotiating table with the intent to negotiate. Nobody's going to come out getting everything that they want. So let's just acknowledge that fact, go back to the negotiating table, and come up with something for the American people that we really need. In other news, this weekend, President Trump and China President Xi will engage in talks to renew the trade pact that was signed back in January. The U.S. and Chinese negotiators are set to discuss implementation of the Phase 1 trade deal in the coming days, with Beijing pushing for the recent measures targeting their businesses, including TikTok and WeChat, to be on the agenda. The virtual meeting will take place sometime during the weekend, but we don't know exactly when. Along with the agricultural purchases and the dollar when exchange rate, which are among the topics to be discussed, Chinese officials intend to bring up President Trump's prospective bans on transactions, not only with the two apps that we've discussed, but with Huawei on the national security grounds. The Chinese officials have not really elaborated on what they plan to do in order to achieve this. So, what's going on? 7 months ago, we paused the tariff war that had really wreaked havoc on the global economy. China was supposed to buy a certain amount of items from the United States to help our farmers get back to work. China's purchase of U.S. goods right now is far behind schedule. Beijing was only a quarter of the way through its efforts to buy more than $170 billion of U.S. goods this year by the end of June. Both countries really have been hard hit by civil unrest and the coronavirus. Although Trump has blamed China for almost everything, most notably the pandemic, economic cooperation is still going strong, according to the White House and their top economic advisor, Larry Kudlow. China is seeking to defuse an unpredictable confrontation with the U.S. that's seen several of its tech champions targeted, with the latest actions spurring a potential sale of the U.S. operations of ByteDance, and who owns the ridiculously popular TikTok. President wants Microsoft to purchase it. Obviously, Chinese don't want to let that patent go without any input whatsoever. The same is also applying to Tencent's Holdings Ltd. WeChat app, which has more than 1 billion users. Trump's executive orders are set to take effect in September that will effectively ban both apps from being used in the United States. This would have potentially an even wider impact than the multi-pronged assault on telecommunications hardware provider Huawei Technology, as they threaten to sever communication links among the people of the world's biggest economies. The U.S. argues that the Chinese apps collect information on U.S. citizens and pose a grave national security risk, as the data is prone to being acquired by the Chinese government. Whether or not that's true, we don't know. I'm sure China's going to come in and say that that's not the case. But we do have to be careful with what information we have that's going to other countries. So meanwhile, given the collapse in the global economy this year because of the pandemic, Tuesday, Larry Kudlow downplayed China's shortfall in purchasing American goods by saying that they had substantially increased the purchases of U.S. goods. China still needs to buy about $130 billion worth of U.S. goods in the second half of the year to comply with the original terms of the agreement that was signed in January. From the U.S. perspective, imposing more trade taxes on U.S. companies in the middle of the pandemic would probably not be the best thing for the stock market. After touting the stock market's miraculous recovery, President Trump would be vehemently against anything that would trigger a drop in stocks, according to Stephen Innes at Axicorp. From China's perspective, President Xi probably wants to keep U.S. relations on good terms, given the strong likelihood of a change in administration, with Democrats really polling well. In the Asian markets on Thursday, investors really struggled to maintain momentum following a pretty strong start. So this kind of indicates that we do have some rockiness on both sides. In other news, presidential nominee Joe Biden has chosen a running mate, and her name is Kamala Harris. She is a junior senator from California, and is the first Black woman ever nominated for vice president by a major party. Originally, her healthcare position was that she wanted Medicare for all. Since her presidential bid was initially launched, her take on healthcare has evolved. Now she is actually closer to what Biden's plan is, that is Obamacare but better. According to CSNBC Jim Cramer's, this makes former Vice President Biden and Kamala Harris' vice presidency makes United Health a buy. Biden's campaign announced the pick in a series of tweets hailing Harris, the 55-year-old daughter of Indian and Jamaican immigrants, as a fearless fighter for the little guy and one of the country's finest public servants. Earlier in Harris's career, she served as district attorney of San Francisco and was then elected as California's attorney general, focusing on the state's foreclosure crisis and other issues before serving 2 terms as attorney general before she ran for her Senate seat. In the Senate, Harris serves on the Intelligence and Judiciary Committee and is getting notice for her pointed questions of both witnesses and Republican colleagues on topics ranging from hate crimes and immigration reform to intelligence issues. In recent months, Harris has focused much of her legislative priorities on remedies for the economic aftershocks of COVID-19, which has generated record unemployment numbers and business closures. According to CSNBC's Jim Cramer, if Harris becomes the VP, that you should look at United Health as an option because of her healthcare policies. So let's stay tuned and keep an eye on this. And with that, we've reached the end of this segment. If you stick around, we're going to have the second half of the show is our college football spectacular. First thing we're going to talk about is what the economic impact of no college football is, which makes my heart hurt. And if you stick around to the end of the show, we're going to talk about the top 10 most valuable college football teams in the country. So stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hey, welcome back. In our last segment, we talked a little bit about what the status of the economic policy is in Washington. So I'm going to take a little time right now to talk about something that I'm incredibly passionate about. And I would like to welcome you to the first annual College Football Extravaganza. But college football is in jeopardy. If you've listened to this podcast before, you know I'm an alumna of the University of Alabama, and I am a huge Bama football fan. Roll Tide, roll. A fall without college football is a very real possibility. Selfishly, I want to see my Tide play. I want to know how we do with a new quarterback, new running backs, and new defensive line. And I always want to know who our kicker will be and if he'll be any good this year. But I don't want to blindly look at college football for my own entertainment. The players are students with families, maybe living with an older relative at home. I also know that a year off or even delayed may impact each player's chances of making the NFL. But here's the deal. I went to Bama BS before Saban. Don't get me wrong, campus was beautiful. We had the best technology for the time, and the small town of Tuscaloosa was incredibly welcoming to students. But now it is a completely different town. Each time I go back, there's construction downtown, new restaurants, bars, hotels are sprouting up everywhere. On campus, there are new buildings. They are always doing construction on Bryant-Denny Stadium, the home of the Tide, and there are more students. We cannot ignore the economic impact of college football. So, what's going on and how is it going to affect our players? How's it going to affect the students and the college towns in general? So, the bottom line is colleges are not faring well during the pandemic. Students are taking courses at home and are not happy to spend the same amount in tuition. Why borrow to pay a high tuition when many professors are going to be teaching remotely? The American Council on Education estimated back in April that enrollment would drop 15% in the coming academic year. Many of our favorite institutions are feeling the pinch with decreased enrollment. My stepson starts his freshman year at University of Alabama at Birmingham next week. He's one of the luckier ones because he's going through a hybrid learning process. Some day he's going to class and other days he's there digitally. But other aspects of life on campus are closed. He won't have access to the gym, intramural activities, and student groups and clubs. And yet, we're paying the same tuition. Professors expect to earn what they did, the same salary they had last year. They're doing the same amount of work, maybe even more. And colleges are spending small fortunes on clean campuses. The Wall Street Journal reported schools were spending millions to install safety measures such as plexiglass, face masks, touchless hand sanitizer dispensers, and other protective equipment for both students and staff. For example, Purdue University budgeted $50 million just for safety measures, and that includes 5 miles of plexiglass. The expenses are rising dramatically as revenues continue to vanish. On top of the healthcare supplies, schools are saddled with decreasing enrollment, refunded housing fees, and the cost of shifting online. This really goes double for football schools, those in the Power 5 conferences, the Atlantic Coast Conference, or ACC, Big 10, Big 12, Pac-12, and my personal favorite, the Southeastern Conference, or SEC. Like, some people wait for midnight on October 1st to declare that it's Halloween season and start carving pumpkins. I wait for midnight on August 1st to declare that college football season has begun. I pull up my crimson jersey and start reviewing the roster. But I didn't do it this year. As of this recording, we still don't have a consensus among the Power 5. On Thursday, Nebraska ended speculation about breaking from the Big Ten's plan to postpone fall football. On Tuesday, the Big Ten Conference presidents and chancellors voted to postpone all fall sports season, including football, amid the coronavirus pandemic, with hopes of playing in the spring. Pac-12 postponed sports through the end of the year. The Pac-12 CEO group voted unanimously on Tuesday to postpone all sports, including football and basketball. The ACC and SEC say their football plans are not changed. They plan to play a fall football season despite decisions to postpone by the Big Ten and the Pac-12 on Tuesday. So we've got a lot of different information, and what do we do with this? So bottom line, is it safe? Coronavirus is tough, but these are world-class athletes. Some of them are still teenagers. They're really not in the high-risk group. However, there is a huge concern about a rare heart condition that's linked with the coronavirus that could end the careers of these student athletes. Myocarditis. Again, if you're a repeat listener to the podcast, I'm not great on the medical terms. Myocarditis Myocarditis is an inflammation of the heart muscle, and that's been found in at least 5 Big Ten conference athletes and among several other athletes in other conferences, according to 2 sources with knowledge of the athlete's medical care. The NCAA's chief medical officer and its 2 primary infectious disease advisors say the nation's focus should be on controlling of the coronavirus pandemic instead of playing fall sports, with one advisor saying, quote, "We simply are not there now." Athletic directors are also refunding tickets for spring sports and student fees for spring semester while instituting hiring freezes, layoffs, mandatory furloughs, and pay cuts, even for their most high-profile coaches. More than 20 FBS athletic departments, including Arizona, Colorado, Kansas, Louisville, Minnesota, USC, and Washington State, have announced voluntary pay cuts and or mandatory furloughs for coaches and athletic staffers. The NCAA Division I Council recommended Wednesday that the Division I Board of Directors give student athletes impacted by the coronavirus pandemic an extension of their 5-year period of eligibility and an additional season of competition if they participate in 50% or less of the maximum number of competitions allowed in each sport under NCAA rules. So it seems like this should be a no-brainer. The NCAA is reluctant about it. Kids are getting sick. So why is there even a question? We need a national distraction, sure. And sports are really a crucial thread in the fiber of America. And please, I do not want to go back to watching professional cornhole. But I think there's actually a bigger issue, and it's the issue I see every time I go back to Tuscaloosa. It's the money. The Athletic reported that Michigan sent a letter to season ticket holders projecting a $61 million revenue loss, and that could double if sports in total are canceled. The school was reportedly asking fans to consider converting their season tickets for 2020 into donations. And season tickets cost a lot of money. At some top programs, football can generate $150 million and as much as 75% of the college sports revenue annually. And schools have already cut 3 times as many less popular sports during the pandemic as they did in the last 3 years combined. An outright cancellation would devastate the college sports economy. Football is the industry's primary revenue engine, and a lost season could wipe out about $4 billion in total revenue, according to ESPN. The implications would reach far and beyond the field itself. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, schools have cut, dropped, or suspended 61 Division I teams and 176 programs across all of NCAA levels, according to data from MatTalkOnline.com. Nearly 20% of the cuts have affected tennis programs. It's an astronomical increase, considering only 57 programs were dropped in the last 3 years. That was before Stanford announced it was eliminating 11 varsity sports in anticipation of a $70 million shortfall over the next 3 years. For the college sports landscape, Stanford hurts even more because of its importance to the U.S. Olympic program. Reducing non-revenue sports as a whole will hurt the U.S.'s ability to compete internationally. Axios reported 88% of American athletes at the 2016 Rio Olympic Games played their sport collegiately. Stanford supplied 29 Olympians in 2016 and has collected 270 gold medals. The sheer volume of non-revenue program cuts illustrate a concerning trend. Under financial constraints, schools are more likely to eliminate smaller sports than to trim gluttonous football budgets. Back in May, there was still a general optimism that college football would be played because of the enormous financial incentive alone. It was more a question of what universities would do to mitigate the risk and get fans in the stands. My fear is for the health and safety of our student athletes, our staff, and our fan base, according to University of South Florida Vice President of Athletics, Michael Kelly. And he said this back in the spring. So Once we can do all the things that are deemed appropriate by the government, university, conference, and NCAA, that we can proceed, then we'll proceed and have to adjust accordingly like everybody else will. During an appearance on WDAE 95.3 Tampa Bay Sports Radio, Kelly spoke to the protocols his department implemented in early June as athletes returned to campus for voluntary workouts. Like many other institutions across the country, USF athletes worked out in small groups, and when someone did test positive, USF mandated quarantines and engaged in contact tracing. While he did call the situation highly concerning, Kelly wouldn't speculate whether football would be delayed or canceled this season, committing to waiting things out and staying flexible. USF does have contingencies in place, including a scenario where they only play American Athletic Conference games. The major conferences are preparing for the worst. Other conferences have already prepared, but the MEAC, Ivy, and Patriot Leagues took the plunge and canceled fall sports in 2020, while the CAA scrubbed its upcoming football season. The Big Ten and Pac-12 announced their switch to conference-only play this season, a move that provides flexibility, reduces travel costs, and limits outside variables, but they've gone on to cancel their entire seasons. So the rest of the Power Five, we really still don't know. While the Power Five schools have a shot at recouping some revenue through TV contracts, the scheduling shift is a danger to smaller conferences. Iowa State, for example, receives north of $40 million in Big 12 TV money, whereas a school like USF gets only around $5 million in conference revenue. Smaller conference schools are much more reliant on gate revenue and other sources of income, such as agreement to play bye games against larger conference schools. That's why you always see a game, what we call a cupcake game, on all of the Power 5 conferences' schedules. The Big Ten agreed to pay non-conference opponents at least $22.2 million this season, and in 2018, similar games across the sport totaled $175 million, according to USA Today. As far as fans returning to the stands, there's no universal arrangement in place. Capacity restrictions and mitigation efforts will depend on local authorities. Iowa State is limiting capacity at 50% to coincide with state regulations, which I think that's a little too close, if you ask me. But additionally, the university plans to reduce the time parking lots are open for tailgating, require face coverings to enter the stadium, move to digital ticketing, install additional hand sanitizer stations, change entrance procedures, modify concession operations, as well as many other initiatives. The damage could be even more devastating to the local economies. Limiting fan attendance could place a severe financial strain on some of the areas so heavily reliant on stimulus brought in by football, from hotels to restaurants, tailgating, and tourism. The severity varies by region. In May, Pollard said hotels in Ames, Iowa, where Iowa State is located, they lost an estimated $3 million over 6 weeks. The city was averaging a decrease of 5,000 hotel rooms per week. With demand generally higher during the football season, that trend could escalate further this fall. According to Dr. Craig Depkin of the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, who's a professor of economics, for some towns, football is everything. He looks to Prairie View, Texas, the home of the Prairie View A&M University, as a glaring example. The school completed a new 15,000-seat stadium in 2016, despite being a town of roughly 6,500 people. Depkin says that the school's intention with the new facility was to drive up enrollment rates, and research shows hosting a football game has tremendous economic benefits in the form of inviting new stimulus in town that would have been spent elsewhere. That just kind of tells you how these small towns live and die by this. Higher education and athletics are going to be hemorrhaging. The economic implications are altogether startling, and the recovery could be a multi-year process. But equal consideration must be given to the collective health of the country. Hopefully, we'll know more soon. Personally, I don't think that there's a good solution. If we cancel the season altogether, we're shortchanging student athletes who are trying to showcase their talent. A contract with the NFL is life-changing for the student athlete and his family. Letting student athletes play will expose them to permanent health problems and potential death. So there's no answer. And I just hope that I'll be able to see my Tide play safely at some point sometime soon. And with that, I'm going to take another commercial break. And if you stick around, we're going to talk about the top 10 college football teams that make the most money for their schools. See you on the other side.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
All right, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me for the GSMC Financial News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. In our last segment, we talked about how the coronavirus is impacting college football and how that's going to impact the local economies. So, if you're new to my podcast, at the end of every show, we do a top 10 list. And going with the theme of college football, today's top 10 list is going to be which college football team makes the most money for their school. I am going to preface this by saying, clearly, I love my Alabama football. And my sweet, misguided husband is an alum of Auburn, our rivals across the state. Judging from the plethora college football merchandise around our home, both schools are making bank off of merchandising, both crimson and white, and that tacky orange and blue. So which teams are the most valuable to their schools? Obviously, the 2020 season is a big mess. So for the purpose of this top 10 list, we are going to pretend like 2020 never existed. So how much would your favorite college football team be worth on the open market? Looking at 2019 conference revenue distribution numbers, they are exceeding record highs for 2019. Again, 2020, not talking about it. The Wall Street Journal, back in 2019, looked deep into college football's most valuable programs from top to bottom and determined the nation's most lucrative brands. The study into university financial totals for football, according to the Wall Street Journal, calculates what a college football team would be worth on the open market if it could be bought and sold like a professional sports franchise by analyzing each program's revenues and expenses, along with cash flow adjustments, risk assessment, and growth projections. So coming in at number 10 is Tennessee. And their team is worth $727.8 million. Auburn is Bama's biggest rival, but we hate Tennessee with the burning passions of 10,000 suns. We call the third week in October Tennessee Hate Week. But the Volunteers brand, in spite of what we may think on our side of the state, is incredibly strong, in spite of their decade plus of, to put it lightly, national irrelevance compared to some of the SEC's other storage programs. Tennessee continues to sell itself at nearly $728 million, the fifth highest figure in the SEC, behind only Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and LSU. Tennessee's valuation dropped in 2018 and actually dipped slightly from $745 million in 2017, as the Vols dropped one spot in the rankings. The study listed Tennessee's 2018 revenues at $113 billion, with a B, the 11th highest in the nation. So, in spite of a pretty lackluster record, Tennessee is still a hot commodity. Those orange and white checkered overalls must be selling really well. At number 9, we have national champions LSU. In 2018, LSU brought in $122 million in revenue, according to the Wall Street Journal. That's good enough for 8th nationally, but that number soared following 2019's run to an unbeaten season. Recent estimations from a Michigan-based analytics firm indicate the Tigers received what amounts to $200 million in free advertising thanks to Joe Burrow's Heisman campaign and his playoff wins. Death Valley is still a zoo on game days, and LSU brand and apparel sales are considerably strong. Ryan Brewer, who conducted the study, added that the value of college sports teams are also the product of the economy in general, which he said is at a fork in the road with more negativity than a year ago, hurting teams. And again, this is back from 2019. But for real, LSU had an amazing year, and Joe Burrow was incredibly laser focused. He didn't even blink that time that the defensive lineman pulled down his pants. So he's great. I'm not mad at this at all. At number 8 is the college down the road. Auburn University came in at $871.9 million. The second most valuable football program in SEC West, Auburn sidestepped a disappointing season on the field with a successful one off of it, bringing in $128.9 million in revenue, the third best in the SEC behind top 10 finishers Alabama and Georgia. It'll be interesting to see where the Tigers fall in a few years if the athletic department moves on from Gus Malzahn and hires a new leader for the program. Coaching changes sometimes can spark an increase in revenue if they aren't costly. But letting go of Malzahn and absorbing a sizable buyout would have been just that this season. Malzahn is not the most well-liked coach in the state. A side note here, Tommy Tuberville, resident of Florida and former coach for the Auburn Tigers, is running for U.S. Senate in Alabama. And his team lost to Vanderbilt. So, at number 7, we have Oklahoma, worth a cool $885.5 million. Oklahoma apparently wrote a book on how to transition from a legend head coach to a rising head coach without missing a beat. Back-to-back trips to the playoffs for Lincoln Riley have led to sizable value increase for the Oklahoma Sooners, who enjoyed a $126.4 million in revenue in 2018, second only to Texas in the Big 12, and a number that dwarfed others comparatively. And you can't put a price on the exposure the program has received on the heels of consecutive Heisman Trophy winners and the transfer of one of my favorite quarterbacks, Jalen Hurts, from the University of Alabama. Another Big 12 title and playoff trip will enhance this number during the fall. At number 6, we have Georgia. Georgia's rise to immediate national prominence under Kirby Smart is showing up on the bottom line as the Bulldogs pulled in more than $138 million in revenue for 2018, which was a program record. Kirby Smart was our defensive coordinator for years, and we graciously let him go to the University of Georgia. But he has the third highest total in college football for income revenue and the second in the SEC behind Alabama, which is better than Ohio State, Michigan, and Notre Dame. Part of that revenue was generated by the SEC's record-setting revenue share, which was more than $40.9 million per school in 2017. The 2018 figure hit $43.7 million to the 13-member school that received full shares. Ole Miss was the only one that did not get a full share because its football team was banned from postseason play. At number 5, we have Notre Dame. They are worth $913.4 million. It's largely because of the current deal with NBC, which runs throughout 2025. Notre Dame doesn't have to share monies made from its media exposure with anybody. And according to Forbes, the Irish's athletic department doesn't even report the vast majority of contribution tied to the football team's ticket lottery, since most of those are made directly to the university. Just going to leave that there. Not going to make any comment. In 2017, Notre Dame received a $5.8 million from the ACC revenue payout, which is a small piece of the $410 million pie since the Irish are only part-time league members. Last season's trip to the playoff should help this year's bottom line. I feel like Notre Dame gets away with a lot more because they don't belong to a specific conference full time, so they don't have their opponents keeping an eagle eye on what they're doing and where their contributions are going. So at number 4, we have the University of Michigan, which is valued at $924.6 million. Michigan had $133 million in total revenue for 2018, and that ranks them 5th nationally behind Ohio State in the Big Ten. This number would swell if the Wolverines won big and finally leaped the Buckeyes in the Big Ten pecking order, but it hasn't happened yet under Coach Jim Harbaugh. Most are expecting that to happen sometime soon, maybe. And Michigan was picked to win their conference last year, but didn't quite make it that far. It's been more than a decade, 16 years actually, since the Wolverines have captured a Big Ten championship. They have more rivals, I think, than any other football team in the CFP. Odds makers have installed Michigan as the preseason favorites, and they're supposed to win over Ohio State in the big game. We'll see. At number 3, we have the greatest football team in the entire world. That'd be the University of Alabama, worth $1.01 billion. 7 of college football's top 12 most valuable programs are from the SEC, fueled by Alabama's financial giant topping $1 billion. That figure includes $140 million in revenue, second only to Texas. You know what's wild, though? Alabama isn't even ranked inside the top 10 in recruiting expenses, despite being football's leader on the trail almost every year. And I attribute that to our wonderful, amazing coach, Nick Saban. Alabama is ranked number 2 behind Clemson right now for 2020. And here's where the other SEC programs not mentioned inside this top 10 rank nationally. At number 16, we have Arkansas, worth $462.7 million. Number 17, South Carolina, worth $460.7 million. Number 22 is Ole Miss, worth $341.5 million. Number 31 is Kentucky, worth $270.8 million. Number 35 is Mississippi State, worth $223.1 million. And Missouri at $122.3 million. And rounding out the SEC is at number 61, Vanderbilt, worth $81.5 million. And Alabama football is empirically the best football team on the planet. The color of their uniforms, the crimson, is absolutely beautiful. The stadium atmosphere is fun and welcoming and has the smartest graduates ever. It's been proven. It's true. At number 2, we've got Ohio State. According to the Wall Street Journal, Ohio State saw its record-setting value of $1.5 billion in the last year's study drop significantly due to a product of broader economic conditions and the tumult of the Buckeyes experienced last season, involving Urban Meyer and the domestic abuse allegations against former assistant coach Zach Smith. The study also noted that the Big Ten missing the playoff again damages teams like Michigan, Penn State, and Ohio State's bottom line and broader profiles. So, I'll just add this, that if we can't agree on anything in my household during football season, it's that we hate Ohio State. And at number 1, the most precious football team is Texas. They're worth $1.1 billion. The Longhorns are printing money under Tom Herman, who enters his 4th season this fall with college football playoff expectations again. When was the last time we heard that in Austin? Texas is indeed back, and the brand is incredibly strong right now. Texas, Ohio State, and Alabama were the only programs valued at more than $1 billion, and Clemson, which has reached the playoff 4 consecutive seasons with 2 national titles, was ranked surprisingly low, 26th nationally, with a valuation of a little more than $298 million. The Longhorns boast the nation's highest adjusted revenue at $163.9 million for 2018 per the study. So, as you've just heard, student athletes bring so much money to their schools. Many players want to be compensated financially. Right now, Congress is examining the issue. State legislatures are considering their own plans, and the NCAA has promised changes, but has long stopped athletes from making any money from their play. Right now, part of that article bars a student athlete from accepting compensation in exchange for allowing his or her name or picture to advertise, recommend, or promote directly the sale or use of a commercial product or service of any kind. The bylaws forbid sponsorships, but also activities like taking cash for autographs or monetizing social media channels. The NCAA also has a rule, with some exceptions, that players cannot participate in a college sport if they have agreed to be represented by an agent. Last September, California approved legislation that challenged the NCAA's ban on agents and endorsement deals. It was, however, something of a time-delayed assault. The measure is not scheduled to take effect until 2023. Still, it has already encouraged lawmakers in dozens of other states to consider bills of their own, and many have drawn bipartisan backing. Some of those proposals would take hold far faster than the California law. In Florida, for instance, one proposal was written to go into effect this summer. But, I'm really on the fence here. On one hand, you have elite athletes bringing in millions of dollars for their schools, risking injury and, in the case of this year, risking illness. But on the other...
You've been listening to the GSMC Financial News Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's podcast.